Usually when you talk about mastering a string instrument, the struggle is entirely mental and physical. It's just you, your bow arm, and your left hand against the notes printed on the page.
Right,
Right?
yeah.
The violin is a known entity. The cello is a known entity. But
Yeah.
then you step into the world of the viola, and suddenly you aren't just fighting the music. You are literally fighting the very physics of the wood in your hands. You're fighting anatomy. You are, fighting acoustics.
Oh, it is the absolute definition of an acoustic compromise. I mean, you are wrestling with an instrument that, scientifically speaking, shouldn't really exist in its current form.
Yeah,
It is a paradox made of spruce and maple.
which is exactly what we are getting into today. So welcome to this highly specialized deep dive tailored specifically for you, the students, the teachers, and the performers tuning into Viola Studio.
Welcome, everyone.
If you have ever felt your shoulder just absolutely screaming after a 3-hour rehearsal of a Brahms symphony, or, wondered why your C string just won't speak the way you want it to, no matter how much rosin you apply, well, this is for you.
Because it's not just you.
No, it's really not. Our mission today is to completely unpack Chapter 12 of Maurice W. Riley's absolute Bible of the instrument, The History of the Viola, Volume 1.
Such a monumental text.
It really is. And we are going to explore the exhaustive, centuries-long struggle that luthiers and musicians have faced to try and, fix or improve the viola.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
There's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
We have 300 years of historical data, exact measurements in both centimeters and inches, and some truly wild experiments to get through.
It is a fascinating timeline of trial, error, mathematical obsessions, and, in some eras, literal mutilation of priceless masterpieces.
Yeah, that part is wild.
When you look at the history of the viola, you are looking at a 300-year quest to solve an unsolvable puzzle.
So, why has the viola, unlike the violin or the cello, been a luthier's greatest headache for 3 solid centuries? I was looking at Riley's text, and he boils the historical struggle down to 4 fundamental problems.
Right.
The first 2 were technically shared with the violin and cello, but they hit the viola particularly hard because of its awkward size.
Right.
Problem number 1 was splicing wood.
Yeah, splicing. To understand this, you have to think about how luthiers source their materials.
Okay.
A maker might find an acoustically brilliant piece of maple for the back of an instrument. Perfect grain, beautifully flamed, perfectly aged. But there is a major catch.
Which was?
It simply wasn't wide enough to form the top or back of a viola. I mean, the viola requires a significantly wider piece of timber than a violin.
And you can't just stretch wood, so what did they do? I mean, they couldn't just throw away acoustically perfect wood, right?
No, they didn't. When a luthier had exceptional wood that was too narrow, they would solve the problem by adding extensions to the sides of the instrument. They actually called these additions wings. They would meticulously match the grain of the central piece of wood and glue these wings onto the flanks to achieve the desired width.
And I really want to emphasize for the listeners, this wasn't just some cheap hack done by, amateur repairmen. I found it fascinating that one of the most famous violas in existence, the Primrose, Andrea Guarneri viola, was built exactly this way.
Yes, exactly.
Guarneri himself used wings just to
Yeah.
utilize that prime acoustical wood.
It is a testament to how highly they valued the acoustic properties of a specific cut of timber. They would much rather compromise the structural simplicity of a single or two-piece back than use an inferior piece of wood that just happened to be wider.
Right. Which brings us to the second historical problem Riley outlines, which is the need to lengthen necks and fingerboards.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah, this is where musical history directly impacts physical design. Because before 1780, music was relatively contained in terms of range. But then the classical and early romantic eras hit, and suddenly composers are writing these virtuosic passages that require players to climb higher and higher up the string.
The virtuosic demands absolutely exploded. I mean, suddenly the short, stubby fingerboards of the Baroque and early classical eras were completely insufficient.
You just run out of wood.
Players physically ran out of fingerboard. So luthiers were tasked with lengthening the necks and the fingerboards to allow players to actually reach those upper octaves.
But you can't just rip the neck off a Stradivarius or an Amati and slap a new piece of wood on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the peg box and the scroll, that carved spiral at the very top of the instrument, that is the luthier's fingerprint.
Exactly. The scroll is the signature. It represents the luthier's individual artistry and is crucial for identifying who made the instrument.
Oh, you have to keep it.
Right. To lose the original scroll was to lose the identity of the maker. So, to solve this, luthiers had to perform what can only be described as an ingenious grafting operation.
How'd that work?
They would remove the original neck, carve a completely new, longer neck, and then painstakingly hollow out the top of the new neck to graft the original peg box and scroll onto it.
Wow. It is essentially 18th century orthopedic surgery for string instruments.
It was incredibly invasive, but absolutely necessary. And it wasn't just a matter of gluing wood together. Changing the length of the neck fundamentally changes the angle of the strings.
Oh, because of the geometry.
Exactly. This meant they also had to fit a higher bridge. And when you raise the bridge and lengthen the strings, you massively increase the downward tension on the top plate of the instrument.
Because the strings are pulling tighter, so to counter that tension, they had to go inside the instrument. And for anyone who hasn't looked inside their viola recently, the bass bar is that long, thin strip of spruce glued vertically under the top plate.
Right, running parallel to the lowest string.
Exactly. It supports the top of the instrument and helps spread the low frequencies. If you increase the string tension, the old piece bar just isn't strong enough.
Spot on. Luthiers had to open up the instrument and replace the original bass bar with a longer or thicker one just to prevent the instrument from collapsing under the new tension.
That is wild.
It was a massive overhaul of the instrument's entire acoustic engine, all driven by the fact that composers simply wanted higher notes.
But as intense as that surgery was, it is honestly nothing compared to the third and fourth problems Riley outlines. Because this is where the viola stands completely alone in its misery.
Yes.
Let's tackle the physics first. So problem number 4, the inherent contradiction of the viola's shape and dimensions. This is the ghost that haunts every violist listening right now. Can we break down the exact physics of why the viola is so problematic?
It all comes down to the relationship between the acoustic air chamber, the empty space inside the body of the instrument, and the pitch the instrument is meant to produce. The physics are just ruthless.
Break it down for us.
Let's look at the math comparing it to the violin. The average viola is about 1/5 larger than a violin. However, its tuning, C, G, D, A, extends an entire fifth lower in pitch than the violin.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that is the crux of the entire 300-year struggle. The body size only scaled up by 1/5, but the pitch dropped by a much larger acoustic interval.
Precisely. The proportions do not match.
Right.
To perfectly project that low C string with the same acoustic efficiency and brilliance as a violin's G string, the viola's body would need to be massively larger. Scientifically, the air chamber simply isn't big enough to fully support the resonance of the lowest frequencies it's being asked to produce.
So acoustically, building a standard viola is like trying to put a heavy-duty truck engine into a compact car chassis. The physics just don't align with the human arm's wingspan.
That is a great way to look at it.
Because you either get a weak, muffled C string because the car chassis is too small to handle the bass frequencies, or if you build a body big enough to act like a truck, you dislocate your shoulder trying to reach first position because the human body just isn't built to hold a truck engine under its chin.
That analogy perfectly captures the dilemma. Because the body size does not compensate for its lower range, you get that characteristic tone that historically has been described as nasal, veiled, or muffled.
Yeah, we've all heard that sound.
Many small violas suffer from a severe lack of sonority on the C string, and the huge tenor-sized violas that do have the sonority are just too massive for a human being to hold comfortably.
Which brings us directly to the third problem Riley identifies, and perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this history. We have this physics problem, this truck engine dilemma. Before the modern era of science and acoustics, Luthiers took a much more destructive approach to fixing it, didn't they?
They did. They literally chopped up masterpieces.
Unbelievable.
To understand why this happened, we have to understand a major shift in how music was written between the 16th and 18th centuries. In the 16th and 17th centuries, string music was often written in 5 voices.
Okay.
The middle harmony was split into 3 distinct parts, and these parts were played by 2 different sizes of violas. You had the alto viola, which was relatively small and manageable, and you had the tenors, which were these very, very large violas.
But as music evolved, the 5-voice structure faded out. We moved into the classical era, and music gradually shifted to 4-part harmony. You know, the standard string quartet setup we know today. 2 violins, 1 viola, 1 cello.
Right. And when that happened, performers naturally chose to play the smaller, easier-to-hold alto viola. The massive tenor violas were just cast aside.
They're just too big.
Exactly. They essentially became obsolete overnight and spent decades sitting in closets and attics.
But then the pendulum swings back. We hit the late 1700s, and the Romantic era is on the horizon.
Exactly. From about 1780 to 1825, orchestras are getting larger. Conductors and composers are demanding a much more resonant, powerful sound from the viola section.
And they needed volume.
They wanted volume, they wanted sonority that the tiny alto violas just couldn't produce. So violists were forced to abandon the tiny altos and find larger instruments.
Let's talk exact measurements here, because for our Viola Studio audience, the centimeters and inches are everything. What was considered large back then compared to what we play today?
Well, before 1780, any viola with a body length over 40.6 centimeters, that's exactly 16 inches, was identified as a large instrument.
Yeah.
Anything over 43.2 centimeters or 17 inches was considered completely unplayable.
17 inches. I mean, playing a 17-inch viola today is a physical feat that only the tallest players with massive hands can usually pull off.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, they didn't even have modern chin rests or shoulder rests.
No, nothing like that.
Trying to grip a 17-inch piece of wood between your collarbone and jaw without a shoulder rest must have been absolute agony.
It was physically punishing. But here's the crazy part. Those old 16th and 17th century tenor violas that had been sitting in closets for a century, their body lengths range from 43.2 centimeters all the way up to over 50.8 centimeters.
Wait, 50.8 centimeters. That is a 20-inch viola.
Yes.
You literally cannot play that on your shoulder. Your left hand wouldn't even be able to reach the peg box.
You can't. It is physically impossible for a standard human arm. So luthiers were faced with a dilemma. They had these priceless, incredible-sounding tenor masterpieces made by the likes of Gasparo de Salo and the Amati family.
Oh, no.
And they had players demanding huge sonority, but who physically couldn't hold a 20-inch instrument. So the solution they arrived at was sheer mutilation. They started taking these priceless old tenors and reducing them in size.
Imagine taking a saw to a multi-million-dollar instrument today.
Yeah.
It is like cropping a Rembrandt painting because it doesn't fit the frame you bought for your living room. The audacity of it is just staggering.
It really is.
How did they even physically do it? You can't just run it through a bandsaw.
It was a highly complex surgery, and there were 2 main methods. The most frequent method was to cut a crescent shape off each end of the instrument, the top and the bottom plates. But of course, you couldn't just slice the wood and glue it back together.
Right.
If you reduce the top and back plates, the sides of the instrument, the ribs, are now too long.
Right, the perimeter is smaller.
Exactly. This required the luthier to appropriately shorten the ribs. They then had to meticulously reset the end blocks, the internal pieces of wood that hold the neck and the end pin in place.
Wow.
And finally, they had to completely refit the neck and the fingerboard to this newly shrunken body. They were cutting these 20-inch behemoths down to lengths varying from 39.4 centimeters, about 15.5 inches, up to 43.2 centimeters, or 17 inches.
That sounds incredibly invasive, but at least you're just taking off the outer edges.
Yeah.
I mean, you're preserving the F-holes, the center of graduation, the bridge placement. What was the second method?
The second method was much, much worse. They would occasionally shorten the instrument by cutting a section directly out of the central section of the upper bout.
Oh, wow. They sliced right through the middle of the body.
Yes. They would literally cut a vertical strip right out of the middle of the instrument and push the 2 halves together.
That is horrifying.
It was a formidable operation, and it left massive vertical scars running right down the front and back of the instrument that were almost impossible to conceal.
The acoustic risk of that is terrifying. You are breaking the continuous grain of the spruce right where the instrument vibrates the most.
Ernest Dundoring, in his book The Amati Family, actually shows a photograph of a brothers Amati viola that received exactly this type of mutilation. You can see the brutal scar right down the center.
And brothers Amati,
Yeah.
chopped in half and glued back together. I am expressing horror on behalf of every string player listening right now. Did it
Yes.
ruin them? Did they sound terrible afterward?
Astonishingly, when it was done by an accomplished master luthier, the results were usually quite satisfactory, and the resonant qualities were miraculously retained.
Really?
But Riley explicitly notes that many former masterpieces were permanently ruined for future use by unskilled makers. These were hacks who were just trying to make a quick buck by taking unplayable tenors and making them saleable to orchestra players. They destroyed countless pieces of history.
So you have these mutilated masterpieces from the 1700s. But as we move forward, they still aren't solving the core problem. The acoustics are still a compromise. And that desperation leads us straight into what we might call the mad scientist era of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yes, the Frankenstein violas.
Exactly. Because there has never been a standard body length for the viola. Unlike the violin, which has been standardized at roughly 36 centimeters or 14 inches, for centuries, the viola became a literal playground for acousticians and luthiers trying to solve the physics problem.
And one of the earliest attempts to invent a better instrument actually involves a massive historical myth surrounding J.S. Bach.
Yes, I want to unpack this thoroughly. The viola pomposa, there's this romanticized idea that Bach himself designed a super viola.
Yeah, there is a long-standing erroneous belief that Johann Sebastian Bach actually suggested the specifications for a new instrument called the viola pomposa, built by the Leipzig luthier Johann Christian Hoffmann.
But Riley completely debunks that, right?
He does, citing Heinrich Husmann's exhaustive research from the 1936 Bach's Jahrbuch. While Hoffmann absolutely did build these experimental instruments, it's a total myth that Bach designed them. But the instruments themselves are fascinating.
What were they like?
The viola pomposa was essentially a large-size viola with a violin E string added. So it was a 5-string instrument tuned to C, G, D, A, E.
So you get the rumbling low C of the viola, but the player can also hit the soaring high E of the violin without shifting into the stratosphere. It sounds like a perfect solution. What did these actually look like?
Several of Hoffmann's instruments are still extant today. There's one made in 1732 that has a total length of 76 centimeters, which is 29.9 inches. But here is the crucial detail. The ribs, the depth of the instrument, have been cut down to just 3.8 centimeters or 1.15 inches. Because the ribs are that narrow, the instrument sits close enough to the collarbone that it can actually be played with the instrument held under the chin.
Okay, 3.8 centimeter ribs make it manageable. It's long, but it's shallow.
But then there's another example made a decade later in 1742. This one has a total length of 78 centimeters, 30.7 inches, and its original ribs are 8 centimeters wide. That's 3.15 inches of depth.
8 centimeters deep. For context, a standard viola today has ribs around 3.6 to 4 centimeters. 8 centimeters is nearing cello territory.
Exactly. With ribs that wide, it could not be held comfortably under the chin. The jaw simply couldn't clamp down on it. It had to be held against the chest, supported by a strap, or played resting on the lap.
So we are already seeing this desperation to find a middle ground between size and playability. But as we move fully into the 19th century, the pressure really ramps up. The composers are getting furious.
They were losing their minds over the viola section.
Yeah.
You have major composers like Grétry, Berlioz, and Wagner who are incredibly critical of the viola sections in symphony orchestras.
Why were they so mad?
Well, to understand their rage, you have to realize what was actually happening in the orchestra pits. Violists at the time were not only using tiny, muffled-sounding violas, but many were literally just playing standard violins strung with viola strings.
Wait, I need to visualize this. A standard 14-inch violin body, but they took off the E string, moved the others over, and slapped a thick, heavy C string on the bottom.
Yes.
But the tension on a violin is entirely wrong for a thick C string. It must have been completely floppy. The string would just rattle against the fingerboard, and the air chamber of a violin wouldn't amplify a C string at all. It would sound like a rubber band stretched over a shoebox.
The tone quality was abysmal. It was weak, flabby, and completely lacked resonance. Wagner and Berlioz wrote scathing commentaries about the inadequacy and the complete lack of artistic standards among violists. The viola section was basically considered the dumping ground for failed violinists.
Ouch.
So the 19th century became the era of the acousticians and the mad scientists stepping in to invent a permanent solution.
Let's go through this rogues gallery of 19th century inventions. The first one is basically just repeating the Bach era 5-string idea, right?
Right. Yes. Around 1800 in Paris, you had Michael Woldemar, who was a violinist, violist, and composer. He essentially invented what was just a violin with a C string, added a 5-stringed instrument he called the violon alto.
But didn't Gretry have something to say about that?
He did. Gretry pointed out at the time that violists were already playing violins strung as violas, so it wasn't revolutionary, and more importantly, it completely failed to solve the acoustic problem of the air chamber being too small. It was played briefly by Chrétien Orhan, who was the finest violist in Paris at the Conservatoire, but it was quickly abandoned.
And then the actual scientists enter the fray, Félix Savart.
Savart was a fascinating figure. He was a French scientist and professor of acoustics at the Collège de France. In his 1819 treatise, he brought rigorous scientific measurement to the problem.
What did he find?
He scientifically proved what every player intuitively felt. The body of the standard viola was simply much too small for its intended tonal range. He even experimented with building trapezoid-shaped violins, straight edges instead of curves, trying to maximize the vibrating surface area to alter the acoustics.
Trapezoids. Okay, so if changing the shape to a trapezoid doesn't catch on, what about playing with the size again?
That brings us to B. Dubois, a French luthier who, in 1833, built something called the violon tenor. This had a body length of 43.5 centimeters, 17 and 18 inches, and an overall length of 71 centimeters. But here's the catch. Dubois completely gave up on the traditional viola tuning.
What did he tune it to?
He tuned it an octave lower than the violin G, D, A, E. And because it was so large, it was intended to be held between the knees, played cello fashion.
So it's not even a viola anymore. It's literally just a miniature cello.
Right. And Charles Henry did the exact same thing in Paris in 1847 with an instrument he called a baryton, which was also tuned an octave below the violin and played vertically.
But the most famous French luthier of the 19th century tried his hand at this too, and he created an absolute ergonomic nightmare. I'm talking about Jean-Baptiste Villon.
Villon was a master, but his 1855 invention, the contralto, was a disaster of human anatomy. Now, the length measurements of the contralto were actually somewhat standard, a total length of 67.5 centimeters and a body length of 41.3 centimeters, about 16 and 14 inches. The ribs were 5 centimeters, or 2 inches.
That sounds completely normal so far. I mean, a 16.25-inch viola is very standard for a professional today. Why was it a nightmare?
But you have to look at the bouts, the wind of the instrument across the front. The upper bout, the section near the neck, was 29.2 centimeters, which is 11.5 inches across. And the lower bout was a massive 36 centimeters, or 14 and 316 inches wide.
36 centimeters wide at the bottom.
Exactly. Villon's logic was that if he couldn't make the instrument longer, he would make it infinitely wider to increase the air chamber. But the ergonomic reality of a 36-centimeter lower bout is terrifying. It was so wide that it made the instrument virtually unplayable above the third position.
I really want the listeners to visualize this. When you shift up the fingerboard into higher positions on the viola, your left hand has to physically reach around the upper bout of the instrument. If the upper bout is 11.5 inches wide and the bottom is 14 inches wide, it is like trying to wrap your arm around a coffee table.
Yeah, that's perfectly put.
The heel of your hand would just slam into the wood. You simply couldn't reach your hand around the body of the instrument to hit the notes without bending your wrist at a grotesquely unnatural angle.
It was a complete failure of ergonomics. It highlights the exact trap luthiers are in. You want the air chamber bigger to project the sound, but the moment you widen the bouts to get that air, the human hand can no longer reach the strings.
And yet, amidst all these trapezoids, mini cellos, and impossibly wide bouts, there was actually pushback from purists. I want to zero in on H. Wecker von Gonterhausen's warning in 1870. He called these inventors the zealots of progress. Why on earth did he want to save the viola's traditional flaws?
It is a beautifully philosophical defense of the instrument's identity. Gonterhausen argued that the viola's tone has a gentle somberness to which its peculiar nasal quality imparts a distinctive, irreplaceable charm.
So he actually liked the nasality.
He essentially said, yes, the resonance is weak compared to a brilliant violin, and yes, by raising the ribs or widening the body, you can absolutely increase the power. But he warned that by doing so, you sacrifice that characteristic gentleness. You destroy that homely nasal quality that actually gives the orchestra its unique blending middle voice.
He's basically saying it's a feature, not a bug. The nasal veil quality is the definition of a viola. If you make it sound like a booming cello or a bright violin, you've killed the viola.
Exactly. But von Gonterhausen's poetic advice fell mostly on deaf ears, especially when one virtuoso violist wholly rejected the nasal tone, leading to the most famous and perhaps the most arrogant viola experiment in history, backed by none other than Richard Wagner himself.
So von Gonterhausen wanted to save this quiet, muffled tone. But what happens when a virtuoso with a massive ego completely disagrees and wants to drown out the orchestra? That brings us to Hermann Ritter.
Hermann Ritter was a virtuoso German violist born in 1849, and he had an absolute obsession with creating an instrument that would correct the very qualities Gonterhausen had praised. Ritter fiercely hated the muffled tone of the small violas used in German orchestras.
And to understand the utter lack of respect the viola had at this time, which fueled Ritter's rage, we have to talk about that incredible poem Ritter quoted in his own research.
Yes, he cited a satirical poem by Schneider von Wartensee from 1830 titled Die Bratsche, which translates to the viola, or playfully, Frau Gossip. It perfectly captures the condescending attitude of conductors and composers toward the instrument.
What did it say?
The English translation of the poem goes, "They call me Frau Gossip. As you might suppose, I'm honest and friendly, but talk through my nose.
Oh, wow.
I shun the big noise, and I'm old-fashioned too, and I stick to the middle, whatever I do."
I stick to the middle, whatever I do.
Mm.
It is so incredibly patronizing. It's framing the instrument as this cowardly, gossipy old woman who can't stand out.
It is, and Ritter took that personally. He was determined to drag the viola out of the middle and give it a big noise. Between 1872 and 1875, Ritter conducted intense, obsessive acoustical research. He studied a 1782 pamphlet by Antonio Bagatella on the construction of string instruments.
Okay, bringing in the math.
Right. Ritter decided that musically, the violin and viola should have the relationship of tonic to subdominant. Therefore, he determined mathematically that the air chamber of the viola must be constructed in an exact ratio to the violin of 2 to 3 or 1 to 1.5.
Okay, let's do the math on that. If a standard violin body is 36 centimeters long,
Exactly. A strict 2.3 proportion meant Ritter's mathematically ideal viola would require a body length of 54 centimeters. That is 21 and 14 inches.
21 and a quarter inches. For context for the listener, a truly large viola played by a tall professional today is maybe 16.5, possibly 17 inches. 21 and a quarter is a literal cello. You cannot put that on your shoulder. Your arm would be completely straight just trying to hold the neck.
Well, Ritter quickly realized that, as big as he was, even he couldn't play a 54-centimeter instrument under his chin. He was compelled to compromise.
I would hope so.
He took his specifications to the luthier Carl Adam Herrlein of Würzburg. Together, in 1875, they built the first viola alta. That was the name Ritter proudly chose. They compromised on a body length of 48 centimeters.
48 centimeters is still 18.9 inches.
With ribs of 4.3 centimeters or 1.7 inches, it was an absolute behemoth. It was a monster. But acoustically, because it was so massive, it achieved exactly what Ritter wanted.
Did it sound good?
Oh, it had immense carrying power, sonority, and a beautiful ringing tone in all registers. It was completely devoid of that nasal quality Gonterhausen loved.
And this is where the story intersects with music history in a massive way. Because Ritter knew someone who despised traditional violas just as much as he did, Richard Wagner.
Yes. Ritter took his massive viola alta to Munich in 1875 and played it directly for the great master. Wagner was in the final stages of planning his massive tetralogy Der Ring des Nibelungen, which was set to premiere at the newly built Bayreuth Festspielhaus in 1876.
Historic stuff.
Absolutely. Wagner was writing orchestrations of unprecedented scale. When he heard Ritter play, he was so blown away by the instrument's power that he immediately engaged Ritter to play it in their orchestra for the historical opening of the Bayreuth Theater.
Wagner actually wrote a formal letter to Ritter praising the instrument, didn't he?
He did, on March 28, 1875. Wagner wrote that the universal introduction of the viola alta would serve to throw a proper light on the intention of those composers who had to content themselves with the ordinary bratsche. He specifically praised the A string. On a standard viola, the A string can often sound piercing or thin. But Wagner noted that on the viola alta, it was no longer thin and nasal, but now free and brilliant. Wagner even stated that this instrument would prevent composers like Carl Maria von Weber from having to add clarinets or oboes to the orchestration just to strengthen the weak viola parts.
Free and brilliant. But I have to push back here because this brings us back to the physics of the human body. Ritter was a reportedly huge guy. He could play this 48-centimeter monster with apparent ease. But for normal violists, Playing an 18.9-inch viola is like trying to do gymnastics while wearing a straitjacket.
It really is.
It's an ergonomic disaster. You would shred the tendons in your left hand.
It was an absolute disaster for anyone not built like a lumberjack. Most violists found it impossibly large. Players who could barely stretch to reach first position complained bitterly that the upper bout was so wide they physically couldn't play in the higher positions. The instrument was loudly celebrated, but quietly unplayable.
So how did Ritter attempt to fix the ergonomic nightmare he created without sacrificing his precious 18.9-inch body size?
In 1898, he attempted to solve the shifting problem by doing exactly what Hoffmann did in 1732. He added a fifth string. He added the violin E string to the viola alta. The idea was that by having an E string, the player wouldn't have to shift into those impossibly high, unreachable positions on the A string to hit the high notes. They could just cross over to the E string while staying comfortably in the lower positions near the nut.
So we are back to 5 strings. The ghost of the Bach-era viola pomposa returns. But Ritter's ego didn't stop at just reinventing the solo instrument. I was looking at his later work, and he actually created a whole ecosystem of massive string instruments, didn't he?
He did. In 1905, Ritter presented an entirely new string quartet configuration. He wanted mathematical perfection across the whole ensemble.
What did that look like?
The first violin was standard size. The second violin part was played on his 5-stringed viola alta. The third part was played on a new instrument he designed called the viola tenore. This beast had a body length of 72 centimeters, 28 and 13 inches, and was played cello style between the knees, tuned an octave lower than the violin.
And it didn't stop there. I was looking at his quartet setup, and he actually added a 4th instrument, the viola bassa. It was 37.8 inches long, bigger than a cello.
Exactly. The viola bassa was proportioned exactly 2.1 to the viola alta, giving it a body length of 96 centimeters. It was larger than a normal cello, but tuned the same as a standard cello. So the mathematical proportions of his custom quartet were exactly 2 to 3 to 4 to 6.
It is mathematically beautiful on paper. But did anyone actually buy into this outside of Wagner? Did conductors really want to replace their entire string sections with these behemoths?
Surprisingly, yes, it gained significant traction. The most frequent criticism from traditionalists was that it lacked the somber viola tone and sounded far too much like a cello section. But Felix Weingartner, one of the greatest and most influential conductors of the early 20th century, absolutely loved it.
Oh, wow.
In 1904, he wrote incredibly favorably of the Ritter Quartet. And later, in 1912, Weingartner strongly recommended that the viola tenore be officially adopted into symphony orchestras to give the string section a richer, many-colored tone.
So Ritter dominates Germany with his mathematical beasts for decades. But while he's doing that, the rest of the world is not sitting still. They are launching their own acoustic revolutions. The turn of the 20th century seems to turn the whole world into a laboratory for viola design.
Absolutely. The turn of the 20th century saw a massive global push to finally solve the problem. In Germany, even beyond Ritter, you had makers experimenting wildly. Heinrich Dessauer built a 42-centimeter viola, 16.5 inches, but he designed it with a string length identical to a standard violin, so players could easily double on both instruments without having to adjust their muscle memory for intonation.
That's pretty clever.
You had Johann Reiter building an octave violin, tuned an octave below standard.
And then there's Dr. Alfred Stelzner and the Violetta.
Yes, Dr. Stelzner of Wiesbaden invented the Violetta in 1891. It had a 41-centimeter body, 16 and 18 inches, and a total length of 71.5 centimeters. It was hugely popular for a time. It wasn't just an experiment. It was a functioning part of the repertoire.
People actually wrote for it.
Major composers like Max Schillings, Felix Strassig, and Arnold Krug actually wrote special compositions specifically for the Violetta.
What about Paul Hindemith? For our listeners, Hindemith is practically the patron saint of the viola in the 20th century. He was a phenomenal player and composer. Did he get involved in these acoustic experiments?
He was heavily involved. Eugen Springer, a luthier in Frankfurt, built a viola in the 1920s that attempted a different compromise. It had a very comfortable body length of 40 centimeters, just 15 and 34 inches, which is easy to play.
That sounds reasonable.
But to get the big sound, Springer drastically widened the bouts and raised the ribs to increase the internal air chamber by a full third. It successfully preserved the dark, somber tone, but had incredible penetrating power. Hindemith was incredibly enthusiastic about Springer's instruments and played them extensively in his concerts in the 1920s.
And this wasn't just isolated to Germany, right? The experimentation was global.
Right. In Italy, Valentino de Zorzi created the contraviolino in 1908. In Russia, the Moscow luthier Eugen Vidicek built a large tenor viola in 1912. That instrument so deeply impressed the Russian composer Serge Taneyev that Taneyev actually wrote his trio in E-flat, Opus 31, specifically for a unique ensemble: standard violin, standard viola, and Vidacek's tenor viola.
It's a complete explosion of innovation. But as we catalog all these incredible inventions, we have to pause and address the elephant in the room, the physical, medical toll all these massive instruments were taking on the actual human beings playing them. We've talked about the math, but what about the flesh and bone?
This is where we reach the ergonomic crisis of the 20th century. Playing these oversized, overweight violas for 6 to 8 hours a day in rehearsal was causing severe physical ailments. Violists were suffering from intense soreness of the chin and neck, chronic tendinitis in their wrists, bursitis in their shoulders, and fibrositis of the arms.
Breaking their bodies.
Their bodies were literally breaking down under the weight and the unnatural angles required to play these instruments. And no one embodies this physical struggle more than the legendary Lionel Tertis.
Lionel Tertis. He's the giant of the instrument. For many, he is the father of modern viola playing.
Tertis lived from 1876 to 1975, and in his younger, most virtuosic years, he played a massive Montagnana viola. It was 43.5 centimeters, 17 and 18 inches long. Now, Tertis was not a large man. He did not have massive arms. The physical strain of wrestling with that Montagnana day in and day out, stretching to hit the intervals, holding that weight under his chin, literally forced him into his first early retirement from concert performance in 1937. He physically couldn't do it anymore.
He played himself into a crippling injury retirement because the instrument was simply too big for his body. It is absolutely tragic. But knowing Tertis, he didn't just give up and walk away, did he?
Not at all. He spent his retirement planning a solution to save future generations of violists from his fate. He wanted to design a viola of smaller, manageable dimensions that could still miraculously produce the massive, dark sound of his 17-inch Montagnana.
So what did he do?
In 1937, he gave his meticulous drawings and measurements to Arthur Richardson, a master luthier in Devon, England, who built the very first Tertis model viola.
What were the exact specs on the Tertis model? How much did he shrink it?
It had a much more manageable body length of 42.5 centimeters or 16 and 34 inches. It was still a substantial instrument, but wide where it needed to be and sculpted for playability. Tertis published the exact specifications for anyone to use in his books, Cinderella No More and My Viola and I. Richardson went on to make over 100 of them personally, and soon luthiers all over the world, from Philadelphia to Argentina to Paris, started copying the Tertis model.
It really became a global standard. I mean, the viola community was so desperate for an ergonomic solution that they even threw a massive coming out party for it, right?
They did. On December 4th, 1950, they held a highly publicized demonstration concert featuring incredible violists, including the great William Primrose and many of Tertis's own star pupils. It was highly successful and proved to the world that a 16 and 34-inch instrument, if designed correctly, could deliver the acoustic goods without breaking the player's body.
This momentum leads directly to a massive event in 1959, the Ascoli Piceno Summit in Italy. This is basically the Council of Nicaea for the viola world. They gathered to finally establish the law of the land.
Exactly. The Associazione Nazionale Lutheria Artistica Italiana sponsored a massive exhibition of modern violas. But more importantly, they sent out an exhaustive questionnaire to professional performers, luthiers, conductors, and composers globally to finally determine, once and for all, the preferred dimensions for a viola. They received 200 detailed responses from all over the world.
And what was the verdict? Did they finally agree on the perfect size?
The consensus was overwhelmingly clear. 186 out of the 200 respondents favored a minimum body length of 42 centimeters, 16 and 12 inches. The president of the association, Dr. Gioacchino Pasqualini, drew up the official recommendations based on this data. A body length of 42 centimeters and a neck length of exactly 15 centimeters 5 and 932 inches. He concluded that while luthiers could occasionally build larger for specific players, the absolute maximum length should be capped at 43 centimeters or 16 and 1516 inches.
So they essentially outlawed the 18.9-inch Ritter-sized monsters. The era of the behemoth was officially over. But what I find fascinating is Lionel Tertis's reaction to this summit.
Oh, he had strong words.
He was obviously thrilled that smaller instruments were gaining respect, but he had this incredibly fiery quote where he said the exhibition portends a further eradication of the undersized so-called viola. He actively told conductors to eschew small violas.
Yeah.
I have to ask the listener, have you ever showed up to an audition or a rehearsal and felt judged for the size of your viola by a conductor? Tertis basically codified that judgment. He saved us from 19-inch monsters, but he declared war on anything under 16 inches.
He did. Terdes standardized the traditional shape to a specific medium-large size. He drew a line in the sand. But as the 20th century progressed, we see that modern science and avant-garde makers were about to completely blow up the very concept of what a viola could even look like. We enter the asymmetrical future.
Right.
If Terdes perfected the traditional shape, the next generation threw the traditional shape out the window.
Let's talk about Carleen M. Hutchins. She approaches this not just as a luthier, but as a hardcore scientist.
Yes, Carleen Hutchins is a monumental figure. She spent over 20 years doing intense acoustical research, funded by 2 separate Guggenheim grants. At the request of the composer Henry Brandt, she set out to create a mathematically and acoustically balanced series of 8 violin-type instruments, all tuned in fifths, covering the entire frequency range of a piano keyboard.
8 distinct instruments, not just a violin, viola, and cello. What were the others?
She created the treble, the soprano, the standard violin, the standard viola, the tenor, which was tuned an octave lower than the violin, the cello, the small bass, and the large bass. Each one was meticulously mathematically scaled to have the perfect air chamber for its pitch range.
And people actually played these in concert. It wasn't just a science experiment.
They did. William Berman, who was the professor of viola at Oberlin College, actually took Hutchins' vertical tenor instrument, which had a massive 20-inch body, and was designed to be played on a peg between the knees. He had the end pin removed and remarkably managed to play it under his chin.
A 20-inch instrument under the chin. The tendonitis just flares up thinking about it. We were right back to the agony of the 16th century tenors. But the avant-garde movement in the 1960s and 70s really pushed ergonomics and radical design to the forefront, didn't they?
Absolutely. The modern music required modern instruments. You have the great Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki writing a concerto in 1967 specifically for the violino grande, a 5-string viola built by the Swedish luthier Hans Olof Hansen and premiered by Bronislaw Eichenholz. But perhaps the most rigorous modern attempt at standardizing the exact math of the viola came from Franz Zeiringer in 1979.
Zeiringer founded the International Viola Society. He literally wrote the book on it. For the luthiers and students listening who obsess over setup, I want to give the exact math of Zeiringer's ideal viola from his monograph.
It is incredibly precise. After years of research, Zeiringer determined the absolute ideal measurements.
Lay it on us.
Body length, 41.2 centimeters, or 16.22 inches. The length from the inner F-hole notch to the nut, 37.5 centimeters, or 14.76 inches. The length from the level of the inner F-hole notch to the beginning of the neck, 22.5 centimeters, or 8.86 inches. And the neck length, exactly 15 centimeters, or 5.9 inches.
That's exact.
Leo Mayer, a brilliant luthier, actually built this specific instrument precisely to Zeiringer's math and demonstrated it in London in 1978.
The precision is astonishing. It's like the architectural blueprint for the perfect acoustic engine. But my absolute favorite innovation from this era is Otto Erdes, because he looked at the problem differently than anyone else in 300 years. Instead of just shrinking the overall instrument or changing the tuning, he physically altered the geometry of the body, specifically for the player's hand.
Erdes, a brilliant maker working in Toronto, recognized the fundamental ergonomic flaw. The greatest problem for violists playing large instruments is reaching across the massive upper bout to play in the higher positions on the lower strings, the C and G strings. It forces the wrist to bend terribly. So Erdes designed a viola where the right side of the upper bout is completely concave. It curves inward, instead of the traditional convex outward curve.
For the listener trying to picture this, it looks like someone took a massive smooth bite out of the right shoulder of the viola.
Exactly. This indented bout allows a violist with small hands to easily reach the highest positions on the fingerboard without any strain or fatigue. The hand just slides right into that cutaway. But because the rest of the instrument remains large, you still maintain the massive air chamber required for the sonority of the C string.
That is so smart.
And to make sure the acoustics weren't ruined by the missing wood, Erdes shifted the bass bar to the exact center of graduation on the top of the instrument to balance the vibrations of the new asymmetrical shape.
I marvel at the Erdes design every time I see one. I mean, functionally, it is perfect. Why aren't we all playing asymmetrical violas today? If it fixes the reach without sacrificing the air chamber, isn't that the holy grail we've been looking for since 1780?
It is functionally brilliant, and those who play them swear by them. But string players are deep traditionalists. The visual aesthetic of the symmetrical violin family is deeply ingrained in the culture of the orchestra. Conductors want symmetry. Many players feel an asymmetrical instrument just looks wrong, despite how perfectly it plays.
And speaking of returning to traditions, while Etudes was carving out shoulders, we also saw a revival of the small cello in this era by Professor Lol M. Kreitz.
Right. His logic was, instead of constantly trying to make the viola bigger and causing shoulder injuries, let's just make the cello smaller and play it between the knees. Kreitz exhaustively researched small cellos from 1550 to 1830.
What did he find?
He found that legendary makers like Grancino and Guadagnini actually made these small cellos. Kreitz managed to acquire a mint-condition Grancino tenor violin. The dimensions are fascinating: a body length of 69 centimeters, 27 and 532 inches, and an upper bout of 32 centimeters, 12 and 58 inches. He played it in the Ruggieri string trio to perform Haydn and Schubert exactly as he believed they intended the tenor voice to sound. Bruce Carlson even built a 5-string tenor based on this research in 1979.
We even had modern industrial materials entering the fray in the late 70s. Granwy Davies invented an instrument called the Viola in 1978. It was constructed out of plastics and aluminum, and it was played cello fashion with an end pin.
It really highlights that by the late 20th century, all bets were off. Luthiers were using obsessive math, radical asymmetry, historical revivals, and even aluminum to try and solve the inherent contradiction of the viola that Riley laid out.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground. Let's bring it all together.
Okay.
After 300 years of history, after splicing wings onto narrow wood, grafting new necks onto old scrolls, literally chopping priceless amatis in half, building 5-stringed monsters, calculating 2.3 mathematical ratios for Richard Wagner, and carving asymmetrical bouts out of the instrument's shoulder, where does that leave us?
It leaves us with the stark reality that there is no universally accepted perfect viola. Every single design we discuss today is a compromise. You either compromise the tone or you compromise the player's body. The fundamental question that Riley poses remains completely unresolved. Should the tenor voice of the string family be tuned like a viola, playing high into the alto clef, or should it be an octave below a violin, played like a cello?
Right.
Until we agree on that fundamental musical identity, the experimentation will never truly end.
And that is what is so incredibly relevant for the Viola Studio audience tuning in today. When you pick up your instrument to practice today, I want you to really look at it. Look closely at the F-holes, measure the width of the bout, examine the neck graft if you have an older instrument. Recognize that its very dimensions, the actual shape of the wood in your hands, is the physical result of a centuries-old, brutal compromise between acoustic physics and human anatomy. Your struggles with getting the C string to speak clearly, or the physical strain of reaching higher positions, that isn't just you failing as a musician.
No, absolutely not.
Those struggles are literally built into the history of the wood. You are part of a 300-year legacy of trying to make the impossible sing.
That is exactly right. The instrument itself is a testament to human stubbornness. We refuse to let that middle voice disappear, even if the physics of the universe fight us every step of the way.
Which leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought to leave you with. We spent this entire deep dive talking about how to fix the viola. Let's say tomorrow, some luthier finally cracks the code. They perfectly solve the viola's acoustical flaws. They give it the carrying power and brilliance of a violin and the massive resonance of a cello, and they completely eliminate that homely nasal quality that Wecker von Gonterhausen defended back in 1870. If we actually do that, if it just sounds like a flawless, booming violin pitched down a fifth Gethni, do we accidentally destroy the very soul and identity of the instrument? If it loses its struggle, is it even a viola anymore?
That is the ultimate million-dollar question. The struggle might just be what makes it beautiful.
Think about that the next time you are grinding through your scales and fighting for that tone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical trenches of the viola. Look closely at those neck grafts, embrace the nasal tone, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. A Viola Studio production.